want to thank Jonathan Horn for joining us tonight. And as he reminded me, this shame on me, it slipped my mind, but he had actually come up to Falmouth in 2015 to talk about his first book, The Man Who Was Not Washington, about Robert E. Lee. And Jonathan Horn is a former speechwriter for the White House. This is, as we mentioned before, he's written one other book. He's staying at home down in the Chesapeake, where he's got a young child. So he's being very wise in doing this. So would you all welcome Jonathan Horn?
Well, thanks so much, Mark, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the Museums on the Green for hosting this program tonight. I'm coming to you from the suburbs of our nation's capital. And I really wish I could be with you in person in Cape Cod. I was looking forward to this when we booked my book tour back early in the year before anyone had heard the words coronavirus. But of course, any of you who've spent a summer in the nation's capital know that you in Massachusetts are definitely getting the better end of the deal, being where you are. It's been, we've had a streak of almost 20 90-degree days in a row in Washington, D.C. And of course, the reason we can't be together tonight is the pandemic. Our founding fathers didn't even know what a virus was, but they would have understood the power of a pandemic. In the 1790s, the United States actually experienced a series of devastating yellow fever epidemics. In 1793 specifically, the city of Philadelphia lost 10% of its population in one such epidemic. And I think recalling that history, terrible as that history is, actually in a strange way might give us hope, because it's a reminder that the United States has experienced periods of great challenge before and overcome, and we can do so again. As Mark mentioned, 5 years ago in 2015, I had the good fortune to be in Falmouth in person to talk about my first book, a Robert E. Lee biography titled The Man Who Would Not Be Washington. And it seemed natural, as everybody joked at that time, that my next book should be about the man who was George Washington. And I had worked as a White House speechwriter, as Mark mentioned, during the final years of a presidential administration. And I had seen what happens when a president leaves power. And that got me interested in the question of what happened when our first president left power. And it turned out, to my surprise, that that story had never really been told. Now, at first, that might seem really hard to believe. With all the biographies of George Washington, no one had ever written a book about his last years. No one had ever fully covered that in the many biographies. Well, have a little sympathy for George Washington's biographers. Just consider how much ground they have to cover. This is a man, after all, who heard the first shots of the French and Indian War fired, who held the Continental Army together during the long American Revolution, who presided over the Constitutional Convention, who served 2 terms as president. Along the way, he married the rich widow, Martha Dandridge Custis. He helped raise her children and her grandchildren from her previous marriage. He presided over the vast 8,000-acre estate known as Mount Vernon. And he forced men, women, and children to work his land and pondered when and how he might one day set them free. And that's something I hope we can talk about more later. And by the time, though, biographers get through all those different topics and all that material, they tend to have hit their page counts. They've run out of time. Their editors are on the phone and saying, "Where is your book?" And I have sympathy for that, because that's happened to me before. And so as a result, the story of George Washington's last years tends to get shortchanged. So what gets left out? Well, George Washington left the presidency in March 1797, and he died in December 1799. That's a period of a little bit less than 3 years. I started researching this book around the time I came to Falmouth in 2015. So if you're doing the math at home, which I assume some of you are, you can figure out that it actually took me longer to write the story of George Washington's last years than it took George Washington to live his last years. And now you're really probably wondering, how can that be? And that's a question that I myself have struggled to answer. And it's a question that my wife has really struggled to answer. My very, very patient and supportive and caring wife would like to hear an answer to. And I know she especially would have liked to be in Cape Cod this week. And of course, we can't do that. But in her honor, I thought, what better time to try to answer that question than on a Zoom chat with the Falmouth Historical Society. So what did take so long to write this book? What did happen? It all at first seemed pretty straightforward. The book needed to begin on March 4th, 1797. That was one of those days in history when people knew they were witnessing history. It was a day when if you were in Philadelphia, you would have seen something that no one alive ever had. Power peacefully transferring from one living head of state to another living head of state, from George Washington to John Adams. It was a day that George Washington had been eagerly looking forward to for many years. He had actually wanted to retire from the presidency at the end of his first term, but he had been convinced that the country would come apart if he left office. So he agreed to stay on for a second term, and he immediately regrets the decision. And by the time he finishes his second term, there really is no argument in the world that could have convinced George Washington to serve a third term. An opposition party had developed against his administration, and newspapers associated with that opposition party had begun attacking George Washington and accusing him of craving a crown and acting like a king. And George Washington realized that his legacy depended on leaving power, retiring from the presidency, and returning to Mount Vernon, his home. So that's what he did in March 1797. And perhaps some physical description of George Washington at this point in his life would be useful. He had recently lost his last tooth. He was very self-conscious about the way his dentures pushed out his lips. His hand had acquired a slight tremble. His back was stooped. His hearing had grown much worse, but not so bad that he could not hear whispers about his senility. His memory, which he thought was always bad, had gotten worse, and his vision had declined. Objects that looked clear in the distance blurred as they approached. No member of the Washington family had lived a particularly long life, especially the males of the line. And George Washington assumed he would be no exception. He said he planned to live out what little days left he expected to have on this earth at Mount Vernon. He said he would never stray more than 20 miles from the place ever again. He imagined passing his time by riding around his farms, by fixing up his mansion house, which he felt had gone to ruin in his absence, and putting his personal papers in order, because he knew that historians like yours truly were one day going to want to see those papers. And if all had gone according to plan, this would have been a very straightforward book to write. But not all went according to plan at all. History was not done with George Washington. Just a little bit more than a year after he left the presidency, George Washington was drawn out of retirement, put back in command of the armies of the United States amid a war scare with France, and drawn into very serious feuds with his immediate successor and his future successors. In short, George Washington's peaceful retirement ended up being anything but peaceful. It was filled with controversy, intrigue, and personal torment. Surrendering power ended up being far more difficult than George Washington ever imagined. Now, to be fair, there was really no good precedent for George Washington to follow for what he was trying to do. Americans at the time were well aware of the story of Cincinnatus, the Roman general who had famously left his farm, ridden to the rescue of the Republic, and then returned to his farm when he was done saving it. But that story was thousands of years old. To understand just how novel George Washington was attempting to do in his own time, you have to look across the ocean to Europe. Well, what was happening there? King Louis XVI of France, who had sent ships and soldiers to support the American Revolution, had recently lost power. And very shortly afterwards, he had gone to the guillotine. And that's how things tended to work in the world at that time. When heads of state lost power, they tended to lose their heads, literally. And in a different sense, George Washington would lose his head during these last years. Now, we talk about that word precedent a lot when we talk about George Washington, and he deserves tremendous credit for the precedents he put in place as president, and none was more important than leaving office after 2 terms. But if we're honest, we can admit that in some pretty important ways, George Washington's post-presidency diverges from how we think former presidents today should act. We today think former presidents should largely avoid meddling in the affairs of their successors. Well, John Adams, who was George Washington's successor, would have told you that George Washington majorly meddled in his administration. Now, of course, some of that was John Adams's own fault. With France seizing American ships at sea and with France being unwilling to meet with American envoys on land, the United States began preparing for war in 1798. And as part of this military buildup, it was John Adams who called George Washington out of retirement. It was John Adams who appointed George Washington commander-in-chief of the armies of the United States without apparently bothering to ponder why the Constitution specifically reserves that title, commander-in-chief, for the President of the United States, or without even bothering to ask whether George Washington might have any conditions for acceptance. It turned out that George Washington did have some conditions for acceptance. He did not want to take active command of this army unless there was an actual invasion of the United States by France. And he wanted to choose the second in command, the person who would serve as the chief in his absence. And for that part, George Washington wanted someone who he specifically knew John Adams did not want. The star of everyone's favorite musical, Alexander Hamilton. Now, perhaps a word is necessary about why John Adams really did not want Alexander Hamilton to be second in command of this army. Well, it didn't hurt that John Adams knew that Alexander Hamilton had actually conspired against his election as president in 1796. But more important, privately, John Adams and his wife both believed that Alexander Hamilton more resembled a Caesar than a Cincinnatus. But publicly, of course, John Adams could not afford a falling out with George Washington. And George Washington made it clear that he would resign his commission in this army if he did not get his way. So John Adams ultimately had to give way. And as John Adams later explained it, he came to the conclusion that if he himself did not give Alexander Hamilton this rank in the army, Hamilton would have received the rank directly from George Washington, who could have just simply come out of retirement and run for president in the next presidential election. And crazy as that might sound today, there's some evidence to suggest that John Adams was right to worry about this possibility in 1798. Influential people in communication with members of John Adams's own cabinet secretaries had begun to float an idea of replacing John Adams, who had begun pursuing a peace policy with France that ended up averting this war, by the way, I should say. They began to float the idea of replacing John Adams as president with George Washington, if they could only convince George Washington to come out of retirement. And much as George Washington tried to quash all talk of this idea, it persisted. And that brings me to another pretty important way in which George Washington's post-presidency diverges from the way we think former presidents should act today. We today tend to think that former presidents get less political when they leave office. We tend to think that leaving office lifts former presidents above partisan feuds. But if we're honest, we can say just the opposite happened to George Washington. He descended deeper than ever into partisan politics. Now, I think the reason that sounds so surprising in particular is when we think of George Washington's last years, we tend to think about the famous farewell address that he issued at the end of his presidency. And that, of course, famously warned Americans to avoid the spirit of political parties. But less remembered is a letter that George Washington wrote during the final months of his life, when he said that the line between political parties had become so entrenched that no one could straddle it, and that included him. And back then, the choice was between being a Federalist or a Republican, and George Washington was very much a Federalist during these last years. He involved himself in congressional electioneering in a way that he never would have as president. He favored excluding Republicans from high rank in the new army he was putting together. He wanted this to be very much a partisan force. And he supported the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts, which actually led to journalists associated with the Republican Party being put in prison. And George Washington was no longer on speaking terms with three of the most influential Republicans. You've probably heard their names: Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. That's your third, fourth, and fifth presidents of the United States. In fact, just hearing a report of a speech that James Madison had given in favor of electing James Monroe governor of Virginia sent George Washington into an absolute rage on the night of December 13th, 1799. It turned out to be the very last news report that George Washington ever received, because he died in agonizing fashion the next night. And even as he died, just the election of 1800 was months away, and there were still people who were hoping they might be able to convince him to stand for the presidency in this election. It's probably for the best that George Washington, however, did not live to see the election of 1800, because he would not have been happy at all about who won that election: Thomas Jefferson. So much for all of our founding fathers getting along. Perhaps the one thing that all of our founding fathers agreed on at this point in history was that the United States was on the verge of coming apart, that they were living in the last days of the American Republic. There was a time when everyone agreed that George Washington could hold the country together. But he would have been the first person to tell you that those days were long past. And if you look back, that the fears that you hear the American people express in the late 1790s sound very familiar to us today. They were worried, just as we are, about foreign intervention in presidential elections. It actually happened in the election of 1796. A foreign power, France, had intervened on behalf of the then Republican Party unsuccessfully. They were worried about new forms of media. Back then, it was the explosion in the number of partisan newspapers spreading what we today might call fake news. And they were worried about the emergence of political parties and the increasing polarization of their society. And just to give you a sense of how far things went, I mentioned the yellow fever epidemics that gripped the United States during the 1790s. No one really knew what caused yellow fever at the time. And in this void of information, partisan theories sort of took hold. In fact, doctors divided into partisan camps. Doctors associated with the Republican Party tended to blame local environmental factors for the disease. And doctors associated with the Federalist Party tended to blame foreigners. So you can get a sense of why people thought the country was coming apart. But of course, the country did not come apart. It endured. And the war with France, as I mentioned, never really took place. It ended up being a quasi-war fought really only at sea. And that presents a real challenge, the one that I wrestled with as a historian and as a biographer, which is how do you tell the story of fears that did not end up coming to fruition? How do you explain people who many of us admire acting in ways that seem illogical and perhaps even absurd when viewed through the lens of hindsight? Well, one approach is just to tell the story from the comforts of the 21st century with all the knowledge that grants us looking back on history. But the problem with that approach is that it robs the past of the suspense and uncertainty with which people actually experienced it. It gives us the smug self-confidence to think that perhaps if we had been alive back then, we would have made better decisions. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. I think you can't judge a decision that someone in the past made unless you understand the context in which that decision was made and what information they had when they were making that decision. So I made a decision on my own when I was writing this book. And that decision was that I would only provide the reader with information that was then known to the people I was writing about. And I would only present new information as it became known to my subjects. And the effect, I hope, is to let readers experience the past through the eyes of those who lived it. Now, of course, that raises another question. From whose eyes should the story be told? The temptation is just to say George Washington's. But remember what I said earlier. George Washington's vision was no longer as good as it once was. Objects that looked clear in the distance blurred as they approached. Washington during these last years could no longer see himself clearly. The story of an aging patriarch struggling to seize control of the stage needed to make room for new voices and new perspectives. His political rivals, his political friends, his family members, and other members of the Mount Vernon community. No longer could Washington dominate the stage the way he once had. No longer could he alone even speak for the name Washington. The name was no longer just his own. It belonged to a rising capital city on the Potomac River. It didn't look like much back then, just some wide, unpaved avenues cut through the trees, a boxy grayish-white house at one end of the major thoroughfare, one wing of an unfinished capitol at the other end. But George Washington had really high hopes for this place. It was he who had chosen the spot for the city on the Potomac River. It was he who had overseen its construction during his presidency. And it was he who had given his name to the place, Washington. He hoped this city could do what he manifestly no longer could, and that was hold together the feuding and factions tearing his countrymen apart. And that was the most important realization for me as a biographer and as a historian and as a writer. The story I need to tell was not just George Washington's end, it was the beginning of Washington, the city I call home. It wasn't just the last years of a great man's life. It was the story of everything that has come afterward. Looking back on his life, on the course of his post-presidency, during the final months of his life, and no one was more surprised by what course that post-presidency had taken than George Washington himself. Washington said, "We know little of ourselves and much less the designs of Providence." Well, I think that must be true for writers too, because I could not have imagined how long it would take me to write this book when I began. And I could not imagine where it would take me. But I'm very happy to find myself here tonight with all of you, and I would be honored to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was awesome. As I'm listening to you, I'm wondering to myself, because as you said, you know, that this schism between the founding fathers. What was the genesis of all that? Why did Washington suddenly have an issue with three fellow Virginians who would later follow him? What was what were the tipping points for some of these things?
That's a great question, and there's a broad answer, and there's very specific personal reasons too. I mean, on one hand, what begins to happen in the 1790s, just as George Washington agrees to serve a second term, which he really does regret doing, is the country is beginning to divide into political parties, and this division takes place in George Washington's own cabinet. James Madison, who is a congressman and one of George Washington's closest advisors early on in the presidency, and Thomas Jefferson, who is George Washington's Secretary of State, will end up becoming, well, first of all, they'll make the argument that the country needs George Washington to serve a second term, and yet they'll soon become the leaders of this emerging opposition party, a party that develops really in response to George Washington's administration, which is the Republican Party, and it really is a serious political division. And there's also really personal causes that lead to George Washington's relationship collapsing with Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. And we can get into all of them, but let's just start with James Monroe, because that's an interesting one to tell, I think, because of what's happening right now. James Monroe was a Republican, and George Washington had nominated him to serve as America's ambassador to France. And eventually George Washington will recall Monroe late in his second term, because it's evident that Monroe is not doing a good job actually representing the true policies of the administration. And Monroe is furious. And during George Washington's retirement from the presidency, what will show up all of a sudden is what we today would call a tell-all book attacking George Washington's foreign policy, and it's written by James Monroe. And George Washington gets a copy of this book, and he is absolutely furious. Now, you may be asking, how do we know what George Washington thought about this book? Well, we have his annotations of the book, and he marked up that book, and you can see in the margins his angry comments about James Monroe, and he even has some really biting, sarcastic comments. He sort of mocks the idea that James Monroe could ever become president of the United States. It's almost funny to him, the idea. Of course, Monroe ended up becoming president of the United States. So that's just one example of what happened. And the falling out with Thomas Jefferson, it was even more personal and in its own way more devastating. And that's also something that will play out over the course of the second term. And it's really during the post-presidency that the relationship finally permanently collapses amid a really strange sequence of events that we can talk about more later if someone else wants to ask a question for the details about Washington and Jefferson. But thanks for that question.
Just a reminder too for the audience, down at the bottom of your screen is a chat feature. So if you've got a question, type it in. And we got a question here, and essentially, how would Washington have looked at Hamilton being a rock star today, for one thing, and looking at Hamilton the musical? Did the play Hamilton give an accurate portrayal of the transfer of power of Washington?
Well, you know, I'm not an expert on the musical, so I'll have to leave that to someone else to answer. But you know, I think one thing that's interesting, I did see the musical, and by the way, I thought it was terrific, was this period of time that we're covering here really isn't in the musical. And you don't get a sense necessarily of what John Adams was so worried about Alexander Hamilton during these years, and what made Adams so worried about the possibility of Alexander Hamilton getting control of this new army that was being put together. And there is some evidence that Hamilton had some strange plans. He talked about using this army to potentially for offensive operations that would have included in Florida and in Louisiana, which were then Spanish colonies, but they were being used by the French to fund their operations. And he even talked about possibilities of going into South America. And he said, you know, the British, they could use the British Navy, and then the troops would come from America. And then as to who would command, well, George Washington would be too old, so the command would naturally fall to Alexander Hamilton. So that none of this is in the musical, and you can get a sense. You know, I think John Adams probably comes off as paranoid, and you know, there was some element of that, but there was also some real reason to be worried about Hamilton during these last years, and there was real reason why Adams did not want Hamilton in control of the army. He thought, and again, it's somewhat exaggerated, and it's difficult for us to appreciate today because it is exaggerated, but he actually thought that Hamilton might try to impose some sort of basically overthrow the government of the United States with the army. And he thought he was going to basically try to use the power to be more powerful than the President of the United States. And it's actually one of the forces that John Adams tells us led him to open up a new round of negotiations with France that ultimately did lead to peace and averted this entire war with France, which is for the best for the United States that we didn't have a full-scale war with France at this point.
Question here, speaking of following up with that one, did Washington and Hamilton maintain their close relationship right up to the end of Washington's life?
So I guess some of this gets to the question, why did George Washington want Alexander Hamilton to be his second in command? Well, first, let's maybe address a broader issue. Did George Washington struggle with his decision to accept this command? And he did struggle. He knew that he could not stay on the sidelines if everything he had devoted his life to, the United States, his country, his legacy, was threatened. But at the same time, he was worried. He was worried that people would say that the farewell address was a sham and that he couldn't be happy in retirement. He was worried that people would say he was too old to command the armies of the United States. France was having fabulous success with younger generals. You've heard of one of them, Napoleon Bonaparte. And George Washington, most of all, was worried about doing something that would hurt his legacy. He was very aware of his place in history, and he didn't want to fail. And that's one of the reasons he wanted to have people around him he could trust. Now, his first thought for second command was not actually Alexander Hamilton. He wanted someone else. But he got some letters convincing him that Hamilton was the choice of many other people. And those letters are somewhat dubious origin. Some of them were coming from the Secretary of State, Adams' Secretary of State, who actually wanted Hamilton, who had suggested Hamilton to be the top officer. And so ultimately, Washington decides that Hamilton is the right person for this. And one of the reasons why is, even though Hamilton had only been a colonel during the American Revolution, he had seen the whole scope of operations from the George Washington's vantage point, because he had served as George Washington's aide, and he had served as his ghostwriter, which of course is very flattering to me as a speechwriter, because he felt that having basically sort of operated in the mind of George Washington during the American Revolution, no one could better step in and be the commander-in-chief in his absence. So that's what George Washington wanted. And so it was a close relationship in that sense. It also, though, George Washington is somewhat divorced from some of the things that begin to happen, the actual operational command of the army. He doesn't take, he's not as involved as you might think. He delegates more to Hamilton than he would have during his presidency. But the relationship is very close, and we know that Washington stayed close friends with, stayed loyal to Hamilton even after the revelations came out about Hamilton's private indiscretions. So that's a great question.
When did Washington know his health was failing?
Well, that's a great question too. In terms of the final health scare in December 1799, he had had another period of sickness in 1798, just as he's sort of overwhelmed with the amount of work he's taken on as commander-in-chief. But the final illness in December 1799 really comes out of the blue. He is surprised by it. He is looking forward to the year 1800. He's making plans for what he's going to do. He is not someone who thinks he is about to die. And he's looking forward to a new phase of operations at Mount Vernon. And it really does come out of, sort of catches him by surprise. The famous story is he went out riding in bad weather, in inclement weather, and he come in the snow, and he came back, and very shortly afterward, his throat was sore, and it got worse. And on the early hours of December 14th, 1799, he woke early in the morning, and he essentially knew at that point that the end had come, and he did not die until late in the night. Essentially what happened was, today the term we would use is acute epiglottitis is what killed George Washington. Essentially the top of his windpipe essentially swelled shut, and he suffocated to death. And he died in really truly agonizing fashion, and it was made even more agonizing by the way the doctors proceeded to treat him. They bled him extensively, and of course, we can say you can blame the doctors for that. At the same time, that was considered the proper course of action at that point in medical history, and George Washington himself supported bleeding, and we know that because before the doctors arrived, he had someone on the estate begin the bleeding process. And at some point, Martha Washington said, I'm worried they're taking too much blood. Let's stop. And George Washington yelled, no, more, take more. And he insisted that more blood was taken. There was one doctor, a younger doctor. There were 3 doctors who attended to George Washington who had the idea for a tracheotomy, which essentially would have created a hole in the windpipe to bypass the obstruction. And theoretically, this could have worked. But given the state of 18th century medicine, it almost surely would have killed George Washington as well. So anyway, he did die on the evening of December 14th, 1799.
Is it true Washington excluded John Adams from cabinet meetings? And if so, why?
Well, so John Adams was not part of cabinet meetings. And what's interesting is that Thomas Jefferson took that precedent. Because if you think about the situation, that sort of became the precedent for how things would operate. Everyone was creating new precedents as they went, and the idea of the vice president presiding over the Senate, because of course the vice president is also the president of the Senate, was taken very seriously back then. So the vice president actually did preside over the Senate. What's interesting is Thomas Jefferson, who, as I mentioned, was the emerging leader of the Republican Party, and John Adams, though he was fairly independent-minded, had been essentially the Federalist choice for president in the election of 1796. And Thomas Jefferson was very eager to carry on this tradition of not being called into cabinet meetings because he wanted to maintain political distance from the president, who he knew in the end was going to be his political rival in a sense. So that's one tradition that carried on early on. And of course, Thomas Jefferson ended up defeating John Adams in the election of 1800.
Was there a state funeral for Washington upon his death?
So George Washington, in his will, asked that he be buried at Mount Vernon, and he said he didn't want any sort of martial display. He didn't want troops marching. He was buried at Mount Vernon, but the troops part was not listened to. So troops from Alexandria did parade at the funeral for George Washington at the estate. when we think of the state funeral for George Washington, there wasn't really a state funeral, but there was a ceremony in Philadelphia. There was a funeral procession without a body, where they basically had what was called a mock funeral for George Washington. And it was at that funeral, at that procession at the German Lutheran Church, Philadelphia, that Henry Lee III, who's known as Light Horse Harry Lee, gave his famous eulogy of George Washington, where he said he first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And for me, that was interesting because Harry Lee was Robert E. Lee's father. So that was a connection for me between the two books I have written.
Quick segue to our next question. I have read your book about Robert E. Lee, the man who would not be Washington. It was a very good read. I wonder, would we as a nation have been better if Washington had been named king? If so, what would the House of Washington have been, and would Hamilton have been deemed his successor?
You know, it's one of the, I think definitively I can say we would not be better off had George Washington been king. And he was the most eager to let you know that he never had any intention of that. There's a famous cabinet meeting that took place in 1793 after George Washington had agreed, after George Washington had taken the oath of office in his second term. And at that point, one of the major issues was the French Revolution had taken place. King Louis the 16th had been guillotined, and Americans were becoming aware of that fact. And there was a real division. Republicans tended to support the French Revolution and be sympathetic to it and say France had supported America during America's Revolution. And Federalists, including George Washington, who was not yet an open member of the Federalist Party, he liked to say he was, at this point he was still above political parties, were increasingly skeptical about the French Revolution and worried about the violence and the beheadings and the bloodlettings they were seeing. Anyway, on the streets of Philadelphia, a satire was published showing George Washington going to the guillotine in 1793, and George Washington just erupts into a complete outburst in one of his cabinet meetings where he says he would rather be dead than be emperor of the whole world. He would give anything to be back at Mount Vernon, and here they were accusing him of wanting to be a king. So you get a sense that this was not a man who wanted to be emperor of the world or king. As to whether Washington ever considered Hamilton his likely successor, there's no evidence to support that. There is some ideological, they were ideologically aligned in many cases, and he did want him to serve as his second in command during these operations during 1798. But there's no evidence that he thought Hamilton was the natural successor to him in 1796.
You made some remarks, which I really appreciated, about you wanted to do this current book, Washington's End, essentially almost writing it as an 18th century person. You're taking what was going on at that time and using it in this book. We're not taking 21st century rules and putting it into this. Your two subjects, George Washington and Robert E. Lee, that you've written about, are now under some attack as some other people. How do you feel about this? So you wrote about him. You kind of knew them somewhat intimately. What goes through your mind as you're listening to some of these things?
Well, I think what's interesting about this is we can draw a clear line between Robert E. Lee and George Washington. We have to acknowledge that on the eve of the Civil War, leaders on both sides saw Robert E. Lee as something of the representative of the Washington family. And the reason was Robert E. Lee had married the daughter of George Washington's adopted son, who was Martha Washington's grandson. And Robert E. Lee was the son, as I mentioned, of Light Horse Harry Lee, who was George Washington's most famous eulogist. And we know that an emissary for Abraham Lincoln actually appealed to Robert E. Lee to take command of the main Union Army that was being raised in 1861 to crush the insurrection, and said, the country looks to you as the representative of the Washington family to save the Union that George Washington had forged. Now, of course, Robert E. Lee turned down that command. And in doing so, he forever essentially separated himself from the Washington legacy, because the soldier who both sides for a moment, both associated with the legacy of George Washington, went to war against George Washington's greatest legacy, the Union. And so I think that's the division we can clearly draw. And, as far as the attacks on George Washington, I think it's important to, I don't think we should fall into the trap of aligning George Washington with the Confederacy. That was something that the Confederacy would have been very happy to do in 1861. There were people actually making that argument. Both sides wanted to claim George Washington's legacy for their own. Unionists said that George Washington's farewell address said, prize the Union above any local allegiance. But Confederates pointed out that George Washington had fought against a union with the British, and he was a slaveholder. And they tried to claim George Washington for their own. And as I look back at this, I think it's very important to look to, in some sense, to Abraham Lincoln for guidance, because this was an issue that Lincoln dealt with. And, Lincoln basically said, he took the words, there was some debate, and at the heart of the debates that Lincoln was in was, did the founders mean the words, all men are created equal? And of course, you can't speak for all the founding fathers. But Lincoln's belief was that they wanted to work toward that goal. They didn't know how to get there, but they wanted us to work toward that. They had set it up as a goal for us to work toward. And part of that was they believed in the eventual extinction of slavery. And George Washington certainly believed in the eventual extinction of slavery. He himself, during his own life, by the end of his life, favored legislative emancipation. He didn't do anything to bring it about, really. He was openly supporting it, but he didn't do anything to bring it about. And could he have done more? Probably not really, because even if he had expressed support for it in Virginia more openly and advocated for it, it's likely Virginians would have simply ignored him. And to be honest, by the last years of George Washington's life, he was no longer the most influential political figure in Virginia. That honor really had passed from Mount Vernon to Monticello, where Thomas Jefferson lived.
Couple more questions have come in when we talk. Did Washington ever renew any old friendships with founding fathers who he might have had a falling out during his retirement? And how did the heads of European state, England, France, etc., how did they view him?
So that's a great question. And unfortunately, if you look at this last period, the number of George Washington has an incredible number of fallings out. I mean, his relationship with Henry Knox ended because Henry Knox had been one of the most famous generals during the American Revolution, but he was unwilling to serve under Alexander Hamilton, who had been a mere colonel during the American Revolution. He was very insulted, and George Washington and Henry Knox had a very close relationship. And Henry Knox wrote George Washington a letter after he heard that Washington wanted Hamilton to be second in command, and said, basically, I thought you entertained a notion of me that was not true, and I feel foolish for thinking we were such close friends. And Washington basically told Knox he needed his help. He wanted him to serve below Hamilton, and if he wasn't willing to come to his country's aid at this time, their relationship was going to end. And I mentioned Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Those relationships were not redeemed. In fact, they got worse during these last years. And perhaps most painfully of all, if you look at the last letter that George Washington ever wrote to the person who perhaps he was closest to, Lafayette, he urged Lafayette not to come to the country, not to come to the United States. Lafayette had been imprisoned in Austria and Prussia, and he had been finally released and wanted to come to the United States. And he hoped he could somehow bridge the gap between Federalists and Republicans. and also maybe serve as an intermediate between France and the United States. And Washington basically thought these were naive goals, and he thought Lafayette would embarrass him. So he sent him a letter on Christmas 1798 saying basically, it would not please me to see you in America at this time. And that was the final letter that George Washington ever sent to Lafayette, who really was as close of a friend as George Washington and most personal of a friend that George Washington ever had.
And how did they view him in overseas? How did the kings of England, France, how did they look upon?
Well, so George Washington really was an international celebrity at this point. He carried on a vast correspondence with many people in Britain, and of course, there's the famous story about King George III saying, if he was heard to apparently say if he surrenders power, he will be the greatest man who ever was. That's not the exact quote. I'm messing that quote up. I can feel it. But George Washington did carry on, especially a very extensive correspondence with people in Britain. And you might be wondering, what was that correspondence about? A lot of it was about farming. He thought that farmers in Britain were the best farmers in the world. He thought Virginia farmers were terrible, and he wanted to rent out some of Mount Vernon's farms. Mount Vernon really was a large operation composed of many different farms. And he wanted to rent out some of his farms, and he was looking for tenants. And he basically decided he did not want to rent the farms to any Virginian. He was hoping to attract people from Britain to come because he thought they were better farmers. So here is the man who defeated the British in the Revolutionary War, looking to lease his land to the British during the last years of his life. It never ended up happening.
That explains his falling out with Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. One last question. What are you working on? What's your next book?
Well, that's a great question, and that's a question that I myself am struggling to answer. I have some ideas. I'm going to go back to American history again. I think I might be looking at the 19th century this time. But I also have a 3-month-old baby who was born in the middle of this pandemic, and she's been taking the most part of my time. And that my duties right now have consisted of a lot of changing diapers, and so I'm trying to think about history as I'm also pondering the future of our country and our children, as I know so many other people, parents who are dealing with kids during this pandemic. So that's a great question. I wish I had a better answer. I hope I will soon.
That was a very good answer. Thank you very much for joining us. I know I don't want to take you away from daddy duty. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. It was great to hear about this. It was excellent. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Great questions. So good luck with this book. Thank you everyone for joining us. Stay safe. Remember, we have another talk on Thursday night. Really a pleasure to see you again, and thank you for joining us. Stay safe in Maryland.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks again to the Falmouth Historical Society for having me.
Thank you, everybody. We'll hope to see you Thursday.